Blanco Canyon 1871, when Comanche warriors humiliated the U.S. cavalry. Nothing could be more horrifying, heart-wrenching, or repulsive to human sensibilities than the scene of the Salt Creek Prairie massacre. 7 men lay mutilated, scalped and riddled with arrows like porcupines. 1 man had been tied to a wagon wheel and burned alive. In May 1871, this gruesome discovery did more than shock the frontier. It signaled the complete failure of President Grant's peace policy. The setting and origins of the hunt, a frontier in crisis. The Salt Creek Prairie massacre of May 1871 stood as bloody testimony to a frontier crisis. Spiraling beyond control, the 7 mutilated bodies, discovered by Lieutenant Robert Carter's cavalry unit, revealed a harsh truth that government officials in Washington could no longer ignore. Grant's peace policy had failed spectacularly, and a new approach would soon emerge from the ashes of this tragedy. For 2 years prior to October 1871, Comanche attacks had transformed the Texas frontier into uninhabitable territory. Settlers abandoned homesteads in waves, leaving ghost towns in their wake. The recently completed Transcontinental Railroad had connected America's coasts, but inadvertently highlighted a vast, unconquered region at the nation's heart. This territory, known as Comanche, remained unexplored and untamed due to the harsh conditions of the southern plains and the fierce resistance of its native inhabitants. Wagon trains and military units that ventured into this region frequently vanished without a trace. One Texas Ranger who survived such an encounter reported, "They come like the wind, strike like lightning, and disappear before you can gather your wits." Such accounts spread terror throughout frontier settlements, where rumors of Comanche brutality kept families awake at night. President Ulysses S. Grant had implemented his peace policy with genuine humanitarian intent just 2 years into his presidency. However, the policy's shortcomings became glaringly apparent. Grant believed in assimilation, hoping to protect Native Americans from white encroachment while transforming them into Christian, civilized citizens. These people can be saved from extinction only by bringing them into our culture. Grant told his cabinet in 1869, the alternative is their complete destruction. The Comanche, particularly the Quahadi band, rejected this proposition entirely. They inflicted more death and destruction than all other Western tribes combined. As American settlers encroached on Comanche territory, conflicts escalated exponentially. Any settler near the borders of Comanche lived in constant peril. Military leaders grew increasingly concerned as Grant's peace policy tied their hands. Colonel Randolph S. Mackenzie wrote to his superiors, "The settlers abandon their homes daily. If these red marauders go unpunished, the whole country will likely be depopulated." Public sentiment shifted towards supporting a hardline policy against tribes like the Comanche, who showed no interest in reservation life. On May 18, 1871, a wagon train commanded by Henry Warren transported supplies to Texas forts near Salt Creek Prairie. More than 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors surrounded the 12 teamsters. Warren attempted to form a defensive circle, but found himself overwhelmed within minutes. "We never stood a chance," recounted Thomas Brackett, one of 5 teamsters, who escaped while the warriors were busy looting. "They came from everywhere at once." Brackett reached Fort Richardson and related the attack. Lieutenant Robert Carter led a detachment of the 4th Cavalry to investigate. What they discovered shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Carter recorded in his journal, 7 men lay dead, scalped and mutilated beyond recognition. One poor soul had been tied to a wagon wheel, offered an opportunity to strike, nearly annihilated their tribe. In previous generations, the 1871 Blanco Canyon expedition, despite its tactical failure, marked a turning point in the struggle for control of the southern plains. Though hampered by severe losses and harsh weather conditions, the persistence of soldiers and burned alive like Lieutenant Robert Carter, and the strategic determination demonstrated by the U.S. the inevitable decline of this campaign, American control of the High Plains, one of the last unconquered regions within the continental United States. Within this broader historical context, the Salt Creek Prairie massacre that precipitated the expedition remained open in a silent scream, fades from public memory, overshadowed by the final conquest of Comanche that followed. Yet the events at Blanco Canyon directly connected these two moments in history, forming a critical link in the chain of events that transformed the American West. By cruel coincidence, the war party had General William T. Sherman to attack approximately 20 soldiers who had passed through the same area just an hour earlier. Upon hearing of the massacre, Sherman personally assigned Colonel Mackenzie to hunt down the perpetrators at Fort Sill, Kiowa. Chief Satanta proudly admitted responsibility for the attack. "I led my young men in this raid," he declared to the reservation agent. "The white men built iron roads through and failed to deliver the supplies they promised. We took what was owed to us." Satanta and several other chiefs were arrested, tried for murder, and imprisoned. This marked the first time Native American leaders faced trial in a U.S. civilian court for actions committed during warfare, a significant legal precedent. The Salt Creek Prairie massacre fundamentally altered you. General Sherman, previously now demanded action against hostile Indians, who refused reservation life. The military received authorization to pursue Comanche raiders across reservation boundaries, ending the peace policy in the region. As summer turned to fall, in military leadership prepared for something unprecedented, a winter campaign deep into Comanche Korea itself. Their primary target would be the Quahadi Comanche, led by the formidable war chief, a campaign that would test the limits of American military power against the most skilled horse warriors on the continent. The Kiowa had claimed responsibility for the Salt Creek massacre, military intelligence identified a greater threat. This band remained the most defiant indigenous group on the continent, having refused all orders to relocate when to other reservations and Kiowa bands. The Quahadi stood apart in their absolute rejection of white authority. They had never signed a treaty with the American government, refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of agreements signed by other Comanche bands, and avoided direct trade with white settlers. This independence granted them a reputation for exceptional ferocity. Their leader, Quanah Parker, represented the complex intersection of two worlds. Cynthia and Parker, a white woman captured during a Comanche raid in 1836 and later adopted into the tribe, and the war chief Pita Nocona. Quanah embodied the conflict itself. His mother had assimilated completely into Comanche culture, marrying a chief and raising her children. The Quahadi are the most wild and hostile tribe of Comanche, and the most notorious raiders. Lieutenant on the Texas frontier wrote in his official reports. He noted that for decades, wagon trains and Texas Rangers who ventured near Quahadi territory simply vanished by 1870. While the Quahadi had acquired firearms through raiding and trade, their primary weapon remained the bow and arrow. Comanche archers could achieve remarkable accuracy at distances up to 60 yards and fire up to 20 arrows per minute, a rate of fire that outpaced most soldiers with single-shot weapons. In close combat, this advantage proved devastating. In September 1871, General Sherman issued the time has come to punish and pursue these murderers. We must enter the Wolf's den and force the Quahadi onto reservations or exterminate them. The Quahadi inhabited the high plains, the final unconquered region. This vast American plateau presented a formidable natural fortress that had thwarted previous military expeditions. The environment itself became an ally to the Comanche and an enemy to the U.S. Army. The region lacked trees and reliable water sources. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. One soldier described standing before an open furnace. These conditions quickly dehydrated men and horses, unaccustomed to the climate. More dangerous still were the sudden cold fronts known as northers that swept across the plains during autumn. These weather events could drop temperatures by 50 degrees within a single hour, killing unprepared travelers through hypothermia. The most notorious section was the Llanos Estacado, plains, a tableland so vast and featureless that early Spanish explorers drove stakes into the ground to mark their path. General Randolph Marcy described it as an illimitable prairie desert, the Great Sahara of North America. This inhospitable landscape, which repelled most outsiders, perfectly suited the Quahadi lifestyle. What repels us sustains them, wrote Colonel Mackenzie in his field journal. The terrain supports their nomadic horse-based culture. They can cover vast distances in a day. Their horses can graze on the buffalo grass, and they know every hidden water within hundreds of miles. Most critically, the High Plains supported massive buffalo herds, the primary food source, spiritual center, and economic foundation of Comanche life. These herds provided everything from meat and shelter to tools and clothing. Military strategists understood that controlling Comanche movement meant first understanding their relationship with the buffalo. The technological evolution of weapons played a crucial role in this frontier conflict. Until the 1840s, the Comanche's ability to fight on horseback made them virtually unbeatable. Conventional military units moved too slowly to engage effectively, and Comanche arrows proved superior to slow loading rifles. The introduction of Colt revolvers in 1844 began shifting this balance. Texas Ranger John Coffee Hayes demonstrated their effectiveness at the Battle of Walker Creek, where his small force defeated a much larger Comanche war party for the first time. We could match their mobility and rate of fire. Hayes reported afterward, a man with a six-shooter can hold his own against several warriors. With bows by 1871, firearms technology had advanced further. Cavalry units carried Spencer carbines, accurate rifles with 7-round and lever-action mechanisms allowing rapid fire. This technological edge enabled Army units Comanche warriors directly. For the first time, the Comanche maintained significant advantages on the plains. They possessed multiple fresh horses per warrior, allowing them to easily outrun pursuing cavalry, whose mounts quickly tired in the harsh conditions. Proved not only dangerous, soldiers easily became disoriented in the featureless terrain. Supply lines remained vulnerable to attack, and finding water sources challenged even experienced scouts. Colonel Mackenzie understood these challenges as he prepared his expedition. We face not only a skilled enemy, he told his officers, but a land that kills the unprepared. We must become as knowledgeable about this territory as September turned to October in 1871. Lieutenant Carter and the soldiers under Mackenzie's command waited anxiously for their orders. The coming campaign would test not just military might against the Comanche, but American resolve against the harsh realities of the High Plains themselves. The stage was set for one of the most challenging military expeditions in frontier history, a campaign that would ultimately determine who controlled the heart of the continent. The March and First Ambush. Colonel Randolph S. Mackenzie received unprecedented orders. In late September 1871, for the first time, a U.S. Army commander was instructed not merely to defend settlements, but to actively hunt down the Comanche in their own territory. Lieutenant Robert Carter received his marching orders directly from Mackenzie on September 29. We will search for the Quahadi east of the Blanco Canyon escarpment. Mackenzie informed his officers. Intelligence suggests their primary village is in that vicinity. Though the exact location remains unknown. The expedition force consisted of 600 primarily men from the 4th Cavalry, supplemented by 20 Tonkawa tribes had maintained a generations-long blood feud with the Comanche and had developed exceptional tracking skills. Carter noticed immediate apprehension among these indigenous allies when they learned of the mission's destination. These scouts fear the Kawi more than they admit. Carter wrote in his journal, "They paint their faces for war and sharpen their knives, eyes betray their concern." The Tonkawa chief explained their unease. Quahadi know every rock and bush in their land. They see us long before we see them. Many who enter that place never return. The expedition departed Fort Richardson on October 1, 1871, moving northwest toward the Lono Estacado. Despite the Tonkawa's tracking expertise, 10 full days of marching yielded no sign of Comanche presence. The vast featureless swallowed all traces of those who knew it best. On the evening of October 9th, The scouts reported disturbing news. 4 Comanche warriors had been spotted, watching the column from a distant ridge. When questioned about how long they might have been under observation, the lead Tonkawa scout
Many
replied,
days they know
our number. Our weapons, our water. They know everything. Mackenzie immediately dispatched a pursuit party. But the fresh horses of the Comanche gave them an insurmountable advantage. The army mounts, already exhausted from traversing the hilly terrain near Blanco Canyon, fell behind. The Comanche vanished over the horizon. The Quahadi village must be nearby. The Tonkawa chief insisted they would not risk discovery unless protecting something important. That night the expedition made several critical errors. Campfires burned brightly across the encampment, providing light and warmth, but also serving as beacons for anyone tracking their position. More significantly, several companies carelessly failed to post adequate guards for their horses. We violated the most fundamental principle of plains warfare, Carter later admitted. We grew complacent in enemy territory. Near midnight, the silence shattered. A single war cry, followed by a gunshot, pierced the darkness. Within seconds, the night erupted with wild yelling. The Comanche attack had begun. In the flickering firelight, soldiers glimpsed hills surrounding their camp, filled with mounted warriors. The attackers shook dried buffalo hides, rang bells, and unleashed piercing yells designed to create maximum confusion. Secure the horses, Mackenzie shouted above the chaos. They're after our mounts. Carter immediately recognized the Comanche strategy. Rather than targeting the soldiers directly, the warriors focused on the expedition's greatest vulnerability: its horses without mounts. The soldiers would be stranded in hostile territory, far from supply lines amid the battle. A distinctive sound thundered through the night, one Carter described as unmistakable to anyone who has served with cavalry. The Comanche had successfully created a stampede. Hold them, grab the lead. Officers horses shouted as soldiers desperately clutched at the ropes of fleeing their hands, torn raw by the effort. Herd after herd of horses bolted into the darkness toward the waiting Comanche. Just as suddenly as it began, the attack ceased. No further assault came, leaving the soldiers in confused disarray. From the Comanche perspective, no additional attack was necessary. This tactic represented a standard strategy for neutralizing enemies on the plains. Isolate them, then let the terrain finish the job. A cavalry unit without horses became infantry. In a vast landscape where walking meant certain death, the morning assessment revealed the damage: 70 horses and mules lost, rendering a significant portion of the force companies immobile. That had neglected to guard their animals suffered the heaviest losses. This is the first tragedy of Blanco Canyon, Carter recorded in his field journal. The tactical brilliance of the Comanche raid demonstrated their strategic thinking. Rather than risk warriors in direct combat against superior firepower, they had effectively crippled a large portion of the expedition with minimal risk. Colonel Mackenzie faced a difficult decision. Nearly 1/8 of his force now dismounted. His mobility and fighting capability had been severely compromised. Military doctrine, but Sherman's orders had been explicit: find and subdue the Quahadi. We will continue the mission, Mackenzie announced to his officers. The following morning, the dismounted men will secure the remaining cavalry pursues the Comanche. The soldiers' mood darkened. They had ventured deep into enemy territory, had been outwitted in their first encounter, and now faced a determined opponent who knew the terrain intimately. The campaign that had begun with confidence now proceeded with grim determination and heightened vigilance. Military historians would later identify this night attack as a perfect example of asymmetric warfare. The Comanche had neutralized without directly confronting it. The expedition had received its first lesson in plains warfare, one that would prove costly as they pressed deeper into Comanche Korea. The pursuit in second ambush, a deadly trap. The morning after the night raid revealed the full extent of the disaster. Tonkawa scouts discovered clear tracks of the stampeded leading northwest into the broken country surrounding Blanco Canyon. Colonel Mackenzie determined they must attempt to recover at least some of their horses. as half their force remained immobilized without mounts. Lieutenant Robert Carter volunteered to lead a small party to track the stolen animals. Captain Edward Hawley joined him, along with 5 soldiers who had served under Carter for several years, including Private Kander Gregg, a young cavalryman known for his steady nerves. Carter trusted these men from previous engagements, but harbored private reservations about Hale's newer recruits, who completed the party. Their small detachment rode out cautiously, following the Tonkawa scouts, who tracked the hoof prints across the rugged terrain. After riding approximately 2 miles from camp, they spotted a small group of Comanche warriors. Several U.S. cavalry horses from the previous night's raid. Carter signaled his men to halt and observed the situation. When the Comanche spotted the soldiers, they immediately abandoned the horses and fled on horseback. The behavior seemed suspicious to Carter, but Captain Hawley immediately ordered pursuit. The soldiers galloped after just enough distance to keep the soldiers in pursuit. The Comanche led them down into a canyon and across a shallow arroyo, constantly staying just beyond effective rifle range. The pursuing soldiers climbed a small rise and pressed on several hundred yards before Carter suddenly recognized their mistake. "My God, we've ridden into a nest," Captain Hawley exclaimed, as they confronted the full scale of their predicament. Hundreds of mounted warriors lined the ridges above, their bodies and horses painted with war symbols. Many wore war bonnets or feathered that identified them as proven fighters, with significant battle honors. With no cover available, Carter ordered his men to form a horizontal line to protect their flanks. He instructed them to withdraw slowly toward the arroyo, while maintaining steady fire to hold back the attackers. The rapid fire capability of the Spencer carbines. Carter noticed women's voices behind the warriors, shouting encouragement and urging them forward, leading him to realize the entire Comanche village. Several minor Comanche chiefs rode to the front of the formation, carrying long poles from which hung the scalps killed in previous battles. Leading them was Quahadi Parker, the feared half-white, half-Comanche war chief, his body covered in black war paint. That gave him a fearsome appearance. As he directed the attack. At this critical moment, without warning, he wheeled his horse around and fled, his new recruits following close behind. Carter shouted for them to halt, but his words were lost in the chaos and concentrated their attack on Carter and his remaining men, now just 5 soldiers. Facing overwhelming odds as the warriors pressed closer, Carter ordered his men to dismount, horses as shields, while continuing to fall back. Though Comanche weapons lacked the range of the cavalry carbines, this advantage diminished. As the warriors closed distance, they attacked in lightning dashes, forcing the soldiers to use their horses as moving barriers. Several men took arrow wounds but remained fighting. With 2 of his men shot, and the situation growing increasingly desperate, Carter finally ordered everyone to fire their remaining ammunition and make a final dash for safety. The soldiers mounted and spurred their horses into a gallop. Private Kander Gregg rode about 10 yards to Carter's right. "Lieutenant, my horse is giving out," Gregg called out in desperation. Quahadi Parker and several warriors immediately recognized the vulnerable target. Their fresh mounts quickly closed the distance as Carter attempted to intervene, finding himself outmaneuvered by the skilled Comanche riders. Carter watched helplessly as Parker raised his blank range. The young private slumped from his saddle and fell to the ground. Carter later described this as the second tragedy of Blanco Canyon. The image of his fallen comrade permanently etched in his memory. The lieutenant had no time to mourn. As the remaining warriors pressed their attack, Carter and his 3 surviving men faced the fight of their lives. Still hundreds of yards from surrounded by Quahadi Parker's warriors, determined to add more scalps to their victory poles, the Comanche retreat and reinforcements. An unexpected reprieve. After witnessing Private Lieutenant Carter believed he and his 3 remaining men would soon share the same fate. Surrounded, their situation appeared hopeless. Then inexplicably their fortune changed. Rather than stopping to collect their trophy from Greg's body as standard practice, that would have included taking his scalp and weapons, and the Comanche warriors suddenly turned and retreated. The reason for this soon became apparent in the distance. Carter spotted Tonkawa scouts galloping shouting their distinctive war cries. Behind them rose a massive dust cloud that signaled the approach of Mackenzie's main force. The gunfire from Carter's small party had accomplished, alerting the colonel that his men were in danger. This tactical retreat revealed Parker's strategic thinking. Carter recalled the women's voices he had heard during the ambush, confirming his suspicion that the entire Comanche village was nearby, while Comanche warriors on fresh horses could easily evade U.S. troops. A village containing women, children, and elderly presented a different challenge. Comanche encampments were designed for rapid movement. They required significant time to transport compared to warriors alone. Mackenzie's force had encountered Captain Hale during his retreat. Learning of Carter's desperate situation, now 500 American soldiers pursued westward toward the Caprock Escarpment. As the U.S. troops closed in, the Comanche withdrew up the steep slope of the ridge line. From this advantageous position, Comanche women stood along the cliff's edge, hurling insults down at the soldiers, while warriors provided covering fire for Quahada's retreating battlefield. Tonkawa exchanged taunts with their ancient enemies, the cultural hatred between the tribes evident in their exchanges. Mackenzie's forces pressed the pursuit, determined not to lose contact despite his recent ordeal. Led a group of soldiers up a narrow trail that ascended to the plateau. During this climb, his racehorse made too sharp a turn on the rocky causing path, his leg to slam against a protruding boulder. The impact produced a sound Carter described as similar to a pistol shot. He momentarily lost consciousness. When he regained consciousness, his men were giving him water as they continued the pursuit. The superior condition and stamina of the Comanche became increasingly evident as the chase continued. When American forces finally reached the plateau, the last of the Quahadi were disappearing into the hills and ravines. Quahada had successfully escaped to warn the village, leaving the U.S. troops without their prize. Carter later referred to this as the third tragedy of Blanco Canyon. After the Comanche vanished, Carter returned to where Private Greg had fallen, despite his severely injured leg. He insisted on helping his men bury their comrade in the rocky soil. All these events occurred before noon. Around 2:30 that afternoon, the Tonkawa scouts reported finding fresh Comanche tracks, which they believed would lead directly to Quahada and the main village. Only then did Carter attend to his injured leg. It had swollen substantially and grown increasingly painful. The swelling had progressed to the point where soldiers had to cut away his boot. The medical officers who examined him found his leg bruised and lacerated with significant blood clots. Though no bones appeared broken, they splinted the limb as a precaution, but their examination was interrupted by the bugle call to prepare their mounts. Colonel Mackenzie, having heard about Carter's condition, summoned him to headquarters. He informed the lieutenant that several soldiers would be sent back to the nearest fort, since their horses had been stolen and they could participate effectively in the pursuit. Given Carter's injury, Mackenzie suggested he join this returning party to receive proper medical attention. Though exhausted and in considerable pain, Carter thought of Private Greg's their mission objective. He declined the offer to withdraw from the expedition, stating his determination. Mackenzie warned that if Carter's condition worsened, or if he lost his horse during the expedition could not delay for him, he would be left behind in hostile territory. Carter, Mackenzie inquired about Captain Hale's actions during the ambush. Carter offered only that Hale and his men had made a grave error in choosing not to elaborate further on the captain's abandonment. With this matter set aside, Carter remounted his horse and rejoined the pursuit of the Comanche. His injured leg, a constant reminder of the campaign's growing cost. The expedition had now experienced 3 significant setbacks: the loss of their horses, The death of Private Gregg and Quahadi's successful scouts reporting fresh trails, and his men retained hope of locating the main Quahadi village before it could be relocated beyond their reach. Carter Mackenzie and their 500 soldiers followed the Tonkawa scouts with the imposing along the Brazos River. Caprock escarpment visible to the west. By late afternoon, as the canyon opened into a broad valley, they discovered the remains of the main Comanche settlement. The village stood completely abandoned, with only scattered evidence of its recent habitation. The scale of the Comanche evacuation even veteran soldiers. Military reports estimated the village had housed over 1,000 people, with approximately 3,000 horses. The hasty departure was evident from and valuable items left scattered across the ground. Of this size typically required significant time, suggesting the Comanche had prioritized over material possessions. Most remarkable was how effectively the Comanche had confused the Tonkawa trackers. The trails left behind intentionally crisscrossed and doubled back, making the true direction of travel difficult to determine. By the second morning, however, the scouts confirmed the Comanche were ascending to the high plains via the Caprock Escarpment, a steep climb, rising thousands of feet from the lower flatlands. Carter noted in his field journal his astonishment at how the village had managed this difficult ascent. With family's supplies and livestock proved exhausting, even for the pursuing cavalry. Carter, still suffering from his injured leg, expressed gratitude that he could make most of the journey on horseback than on foot. Upon reaching the summit, the soldiers emerged onto an entirely different landscape. Carter documented the scene. The expedition had left the canyon and entered a vast grassland, stretching to the horizon, without a single bush grass tuft, stone or any object to break the monotony. The elevation measured approximately 3,000 feet above sea level. While previous days had been warm and sunny, conditions at this altitude presented a stark contrast. Early that afternoon, Carter detected a continued tracking the village through the buffalo grass, noting that the Comanche repeatedly led them along cliff edges, down into ravines, and back up again, attempting to delay pursuit with difficult terrain. The Tonkawa maintained contact with the trail. The tracks grew increasingly fresh as the pursuit continued. Eventually, Carter spotted silhouettes moving along a distant ridgeline. The village was now only a few miles ahead, within striking distance, for the first time in the campaign. As the afternoon progressed, the temperature continued to fall. Wind gusts cut through the soldiers' summer uniforms. Carter recognized the warning signs of an approaching norther. A sudden severe cold storms rarely appeared this early in the season, and the expedition carried no combination of wind and snow to the entire command. If proper precautions weren't taken, with the village only 2 or 3 miles ahead, the pursuit accelerated. The Comanche, recognizing the closing gap, deployed warriors to both flanks of the military formation. Carter immediately identified this as a harassment tactic to draw the soldiers away from their objective. Mackenzie refused the bait, ordering his men to protect the mule, train and ammunition supplies, while using carbine fire to maintain distance from the flanking warriors. The expedition pressed forward. As conditions deteriorated rapidly, the sky darkened and the wind intensified. Temperatures dropped below freezing, with gusts reaching 50 miles per hour, making the pursuit increasingly difficult. Despite these challenges, morale improved when soldiers began finding abandoned items from the fleeing village. Lodgepoles, implements, buffalo hides, and even puppies. These discarded possessions indicated the Comanche were lightening their loads to increase speed. Throughout the commotion, Carter barely noticed his injured leg. His attention focused entirely on the impending confrontation. The Tonkawa scouts began applying war paint in preparation for battle. With the village now only 1 mile ahead, Carter believed their moment of victory had arrived. The final assault never materialized, as sleet and snow began lashing the soldiers' penetrating their clothing. All eyes turned to Colonel Mackenzie for the attack order. In a decision that would prove Mackenzie commanded the expedition to halt and make camp rather than assault the village. In deteriorating conditions, Carter documented his frustration. Despite the storm, he felt this represented their best, perhaps only opportunity to complete their mission. Mackenzie, however, considered the deteriorating conditions, the exhaustion of his men and horses, after days of hard marching, and the Comanche advantage of fresh mounts. He concluded that an assault under these circumstances risked disaster. The norther intensified throughout the night. A few Comanche warriors monitored the camp perimeter, but departed. Upon confirming the soldiers would not resume pursuit, the expedition now focused on survival. Rather than combat, Sleek turned to Hale, pelting animals and raising bruises on exposed skin. Soldiers improvised shelters using canvas tarps, while Carter wrapped himself in a buffalo robe to prevent hypothermia. By morning, the storm had passed. The day dawned warm and clear, but the Comanche village had vanished completely. Carter referred to this as the final tragedy of Blanco Canyon. While the soldiers had sheltered from the norther, the Comanche had continued their retreat through the night, using the storm as cover for their escape. The storm's aftermath complicated tracking efforts. Significantly, rain and snow had washed away most signs of the village's effectively passage, ending any chance of successful pursuit. Demonstrating their mastery of both warfare and the harsh environment they called home. Retreat in aftermath, tactical defeat, strategic victory. The morning after Colonel Mackenzie faced expedition now stood 40 miles from its supply lines in hostile territory. With diminishing resources and exhausted animals, the decision to retreat became inevitable. Though Mackenzie made it reluctantly, Lieutenant Carter documented the reason. Our animals were now suffering from thirst, and several showed signs of complete exhaustion. Our provisions grew increasingly scarce. The Comanche, thanks to that fortunate storm, at least a night's march advantage. Thus the colonel prudently, but reluctantly, ordered our return. Disappointment permeated the ranks. Soldiers who had endured injuries, cold and grueling marches, now faced the psychological burden of retreat. Without achieving their primary objective, the campaign had failed in its immediate goal, the Quahadi village. At each critical juncture, the Comanche had outmaneuvered them. First through the night raid on their horses, then through the ambush at Blanco Canyon, and finally by exploiting the unexpected northerner. The return journey further demonstrated Mackenzie's frustration when Tonkawa scouts discovered two lost Comanche warriors and cornered them in a ravine. The colonel personally led the pursuit, rather than delegating the task. This uncharacteristic resulted in an arrow wound to his leg. Before the outnumbered Comanche were overwhelmed, 2 additional soldiers sustained injuries during this skirmish. One shot in the abdomen and another returning in the arm. To Fort Richardson, both Carter and Mackenzie received medical treatment for their leg wounds. Despite the physical cost, both officers recovered sufficiently to return to active duty within weeks. Lieutenant Carter's actions during the strategic withdrawal from the Comanche ambush were recognized with the Congressional Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, though the Blanco Canyon expedition to achieve its immediate tactical objectives. Military historians have identified it as a pivotal moment in the Plains campaign. Marked the first concentrated effort to pursue the Comanche into their stronghold rather than merely responding to raids. This shift in strategy carried profound implications. Seguin, writing for the Army and Navy Journal, assessed the expedition's previous military expeditions had penetrated the borders of Common Korea and demonstrated to the Indians that their home range was no longer entirely secure, but they did not fundamentally alter the balance of power. Now, through deliberate intrusion into the heart of their territory, the Bluecoat leaders signal their intention not merely to defend the frontier, but to extirpate the wolf in its den. This strategic transformation proved decisive. While Comanche power had dominated the Southern Plains, by the 1870s it existed largely as an illusion. Had declined precipitously due to disease and warfare, while American weapons technology had advanced significantly. The psychological impact of Army operating deep in Commandaria demonstrated that nowhere remained truly safe from American military years reach. Of the Blanco Canyon expedition, the free-roaming days of the Comanche, Colonel Randolph S. Mackenzie would lead this final campaign in 1874. 1875, systematically destroying Comanche winter camps and horse herds until starvation forced their surrender. The last Comanche bands, including Quanah Parker and his Quahadi, would reluctantly enter the reservation in June 1875. The Tonkawa Scouts, who played a crucial role in the Blanco represented Canyon another dimension of this conflict. The U.S. Army systematically exploited long-standing tribal animosities by employing indigenous scouts against their traditional enemies. For the Tonkawa, participation